My name is Zuri and I am 34 years old. Just 48 hours after I buried my mother-in-law, I returned to our estate to find my entire life packed into 2 suitcases on the front porch. When I walked inside, my husband Julian tossed a cheap fake ring at my feet. He smiled and told me he had just inherited $80 million and no longer needed a charity case for a wife. He thought he was throwing away a piece of trash. He had no idea that his little power trip would cost him his entire empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stay perfectly calm while a toxic person tried to break you. Driving back to our home in the wealthy neighborhood of Buckhead, I felt a level of exhaustion I had never experienced before. For an entire week, I had played the role of the perfect grieving daughter-in-law. My mother-in-law, Vivian, was a titan in the Atlanta commercial real estate scene. Her funeral was not a private family mourning. It was a massive networking event for the rich and powerful. While my husband Julian and his sister were busy pretending to cry for the cameras and mingling with local politicians, I was the one running the show behind the scenes. I coordinated with the funeral directors. I managed the florists. I made sure the caterers followed Vivian's exact instructions. My bones ached deeply, and my feet were completely blistered from wearing black stilettos for 12 hours straight. All I wanted to do was walk through the massive front doors of my home, take a hot shower, and sleep for 2 solid days. But as my car slowly pulled up the sweeping circular driveway, my headlights washed over something completely out of place. I shifted the car into park and stared blankly through the windshield. Sitting right there on the cold stone steps of the front porch were my 2 navy blue designer suitcases. They were not placed neatly as if waiting for a trip. One was tipped over on its side. It was half unzipped, and the sleeve of my favorite emerald green silk blouse was hanging out, caught in the metal teeth of the zipper. For a few long seconds, my exhausted brain simply could not process what I was looking at. I thought maybe the housekeeping staff was packing away old clothes for donation. But the heavy, sinking knot forming in my stomach told me the ugly truth long before my mind was ready to accept it. I stepped out of the car into the chilly evening air. The massive custom glass doors of our home stood imposing and silent against the night sky. I walked up the stone steps, grabbed the handles of my luggage, and pushed the heavy door open. The grand marble foyer felt entirely different now that Vivian was gone. The air was thick and hollow. I left the bags near the entrance and walked toward the sunken living room. The sharp click of my heels echoed loudly against the imported hardwood floors, announcing my arrival. Julian was already there. He was 36 years old and had spent every single day of his life coasting comfortably on his mother's wealth and reputation. He was sprawled out on the custom Italian leather sofa. This was the exact sofa that Vivian had strictly forbidden anyone from putting their shoes on. Now Julian's expensive leather loafers were resting directly on the pristine white cushions. He held a crystal glass of dark whiskey in one hand and his phone in the other. He did not even bother to look up from his screen when I walked into the room. I stood there in my black morning dress, just staring at the man I had been married to for 5 years. I called his name, my voice completely hoarse from days of organizing his mother's funeral. I asked him why my bags were sitting out on the front porch like garbage. Julian finally locked his phone and dropped it onto the glass coffee table. He took a slow and deliberate sip of his whiskey before he finally looked up at me. His eyes were completely cold. There was absolutely no grief for his mother in his expression. There was no warmth or love for his wife. There was only pure, unadulterated arrogance. He told me the bags were out there because I no longer lived in this house. His voice was smooth and completely steady. He spoke to me carelessly, like he was discussing the weather. I blinked, trying to process his words. I asked him if he had lost his mind and reminded him that we had literally just buried his mother that very morning. Julian swung his legs off the sofa and stood up. He smoothed down the front of his tailored black suit and smiled a very dark smile. He told me that was exactly the point. The charity act was officially over. He said the only reason he kept me around for the past 5 years was to keep his mother happy. According to him, Vivian liked my working-class hustle. She liked that I was a senior tax auditor who had dragged herself up from the rough side of South Atlanta. It made her feel good to have a self-made woman around the family. But she was gone now. Julian reached into his suit pocket and pulled something small out. With a quick flick of his wrist, he tossed it across the room. The object hit my chest hard and clattered onto the floor, rolling to a stop right next to my shoe. I looked down. It was a ring. But it was not the 3-carat diamond engagement ring he had placed on my finger 5 years ago. It was a cheap cubic zirconia replica. The kind of garbage you would buy at a mall kiosk for $50. Julian smirked cruelly and told me he had swapped it out yesterday while I was busy dealing with the florist. He claimed the real diamond belonged to the Hayes family estate and that the fake piece of trash on the floor was what I actually deserved. He took a step closer, his tall frame towering over me. He announced that he had just gotten off the phone with the estate lawyers. The will was ironclad, and he was the sole male heir. He looked me dead in the eye and proudly stated that he had just inherited $80 million in commercial real estate and liquid assets. He was the king of the Hayes empire now. He told me he did not need a nagging, penny-pinching accountant telling him how to live his life. He said I had outlived my usefulness and told me to take my cheap clothes and my fake ring and get off his property immediately. The silence in the living room was deafening. The man standing in front of me was a complete stranger. The mask of the loving husband had slipped away entirely, revealing the greedy, narcissistic parasite hiding underneath. He was waiting for me to break down. He expected me to scream and cry and fall to my knees begging to save my marriage. He wanted me to weep over the immense wealth I was supposedly losing, but I gave him absolutely nothing. The betrayal was so sharp and so incredibly sudden that it bypassed anger entirely. I went straight into a freezing, deadpan shock. My chest tightened painfully, but my eyes remained completely dry. I was not going to give this man the satisfaction of a single tear. I just looked down at the fake ring on the floor and then looked back up at his arrogant, smiling face. Before I could even formulate a response to Julian, a slow and mocking chuckle echoed from the arched doorway of the living room. I did not have to turn around to know who it was. The heavy scent of expensive cedarwood cologne and the sound of ice clinking in a crystal glass announced him before he even stepped into the light. It was Preston. He was the white husband of Julian's younger sister, Chloe. He leaned against the doorframe, looking like he had just stepped out of a country club promotional brochure, wearing a crisp pastel polo and freshly pressed khaki trousers. He held a glass of Vivian's most expensive vintage wine, swirling the dark red liquid with a lazy and arrogant flick of his wrist. Preston always carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he was inherently superior to everyone else in the room. He had married into a wealthy black family, but he constantly acted as if he was the one gracing us with his presence. He took a long, slow sip of the wine and let out a highly exaggerated sigh of satisfaction. "Well, Julian," he drawled, his voice completely dripping with condescension. "I have to admit I did not think you actually had the spine to go through with it, but looking at her standing there with her cheap luggage, I must say the house already feels 10 times lighter." I slowly turned my head to look at him. Preston offered me a patronizing and deeply insulting smile. It was the exact same smile he used whenever he complimented me on being so incredibly articulate for someone from my specific neighborhood. "Do not look so surprised, Zuri," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step into the living room. "You had to know this day was coming eventually. You never really fit in here, did you? I mean, let us be perfectly honest with each other for once. You can buy a girl from South Atlanta a designer morning dress, but you can never wash off that lingering working-class stench." He paced slowly around the edge of the room, running his free hand along the edge of a custom mahogany bookshelf. He spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. Vivian was a very generous woman. Preston continued, his tone sounding completely conversational, as if we were discussing a television show. "She truly loved a good charity project. She took you in and she polished you up. She let you sit at the table with the real elite of this city. We let you pretend you belonged in the same circles as families who have been building their wealth and legacy for generations. We let you smile at the country club dinners and nod along at the charity galas. But you and I both know the absolute truth. You were always just a tourist in the world of the black elite. My hands fell to my sides. My fingers brushed against the rigid handle of the suitcase I had dragged back inside the foyer with me. I wrapped my hand around the thick leather grip. I squeezed it. I squeezed it so hard that the heavy leather actually creaked under the immense pressure. If there had been a mirror placed in front of me, I knew I would see my knuckles turning completely white from the sheer violent force of my grip. My manicured nails dug painfully into the soft skin of my own palms. Every single muscle in my arms and shoulders was screaming at me to lunge forward. I wanted to wipe that smug, entitled smile right off his face. I wanted to loudly remind him that he was nothing but a broke and struggling mortgage broker when he first met Chloe. I wanted to scream that every single dime he was currently drinking, wearing, and standing on belonged entirely to the very family he was currently mocking. But I did not move a single inch. I did not let a single ounce of that boiling rage travel up to my face. My expression remained a perfectly calm and completely unreadable mask. Preston noticed my silence and immediately mistook it for submission. He took another sip of his wine and chuckled darkly. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could literally smell the sharp tang of the alcohol on his breath. "You see, Zuri," he whispered, leaning in slightly to invade my personal space. "Wealth is not just about having money sitting in a bank account. It is about pedigree. It is about knowing exactly how to exist in these high society spaces without looking like you are constantly apologizing for taking up air. You always had that desperate and hungry look in your eyes, that little ghetto hustle. It was cute for a little while, I suppose. But Julian is a multimillionaire now. He is the head of the Hayes family. He needs a wife who actually understands how this world operates. Not a glorified calculator who still mentally checks the prices on a menu at a five-star restaurant." Julian let out a loud, barking laugh from the leather sofa, clearly enjoying the show his brother-in-law was putting on. He raised his whiskey glass toward Preston in a silent and mocking toast. They were feeding off each other completely, reveling in their shared cruelty. Two grown men bonding over the calculated humiliation of a woman who had just spent the last 7 days burying the only person who actually held this entire family together. Preston took one final sip of his wine and swallowed loudly. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unhidden disgust. "So be a good little girl and run along back to whatever cramped little apartment you originally crawled out of. And do not even try to fight this in divorce court. I have golfing buddies who are judges in this county. I will personally make sure you walk away with absolutely nothing. We are completely done with you." I stood there in the center of the room, letting his empty threats wash right over me. The sheer audacity of this mediocre white man standing in my mother-in-law's house, drinking her expensive wine, and acting as the ultimate gatekeeper to a culture and a fortune he had absolutely zero blood claim to was almost comical. He felt so incredibly powerful in this exact moment. He felt totally untouchable. He honestly believed he was the smartest and most cunning person in the room. He thought I was just a defeated and broken woman clinging to her luggage with nowhere left to go. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 3 nights wide awake, sitting in my home office, meticulously combing through every single one of the company financial records. He did not know that I had already found the massive gaping hole hidden deep inside the corporate accounts. He did not know that I had already successfully traced the $5 million fraudulent loan he had secretly taken out against Vivian's estate, while she was lying helpless in a hospital bed on life support. I slowly loosened my tight grip on the suitcase handle. The warm blood slowly rushed back into my numb and aching fingers. I took a deep, silent breath and let it out smoothly. I did not raise my voice. I did not give either of them the dramatic, emotional reaction they were so desperately craving from me. Instead of exploding, I simply shifted my gaze away from Preston and locked eyes directly with Julian. My husband was still lounging on the sofa, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He was waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He wanted me to scream about how unfair this was. He wanted me to beg for a financial settlement or demand to stay in the house I had helped maintain for half a decade. He wanted me to cry over the years I had wasted being a dutiful wife, but I was not going to give him a single drop of that satisfaction. I took one step forward, completely ignoring the fake diamond ring that was still resting near my shoe. I looked at Julian with an expression of pure clinical curiosity. My face was completely blank. "Julian," I said, my voice steady and perfectly even. "I'm going to ask you this only one time. Did you actually read all the documents the estate lawyer sent over to you? Did you read every single page carefully?" For a fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of confusion crossed his face. He clearly had not expected a calm legal question from a woman who had just been evicted from her own home. But his boundless ego quickly buried any potential doubt. Julian threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was the laugh of a man who firmly believed he had already won the ultimate prize. "Why would I waste my time reading 50 pages of boring legal jargon?" he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively in the air. "The lawyer called me this afternoon and gave me the only summary that matters. My mother left me the entire company. I am the sole male heir to the Hayes legacy. I own the commercial buildings. I own the liquid assets. I own this house. I own absolutely everything. The rest of the paperwork is just standard legal red tape for the accountants to sort out later." He took another sip of his whiskey, completely unbothered by his own ignorance. "You always were obsessed with the fine print, Zuri. Look exactly where it got you. You are standing in my foyer with your bags packed like a common maid while I am sitting on an $80 million empire. You can take your little auditing skills and go balance a checkbook in a one-bedroom apartment." Preston chuckled loudly from the doorway, swirling his wine again. "She is probably hoping there is a hidden clause that grants her a generous severance package, Julian. You better make sure security escorts her off the property before she tries to steal the silverware on her way out. I hear old habits die hard." I did not even bother looking in Preston's direction. My eyes remained completely fixed on Julian. I was staring at a man who was so blinded by greed and unearned privilege that he could not even see the massive trap he had just willingly walked right into. He was so eager to throw me out and claim his throne that he had completely ignored the most fundamental rule of business his own mother had always preached. Always read the fine print, always read the second page. "I see," I replied softly. My voice was completely devoid of any anger or sadness. "Well, Julian, I suppose there is nothing left to say. Congratulations on your inheritance." I slowly turned my back to him. I did not bend down to pick up the fake cubic zirconia ring. I left it sitting right there on the hard wooden floor where it belonged. It was a perfect symbol of his character, cheap, entirely fake, and completely worthless. I walked over to my 2 suitcases and firmly gripped the leather handles. Without looking back a single time, I pulled the heavy front door open and stepped out into the freezing Atlanta night air. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, severing my ties to the Hayes family forever. I loaded my bags into the trunk of my car, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I drove away from the massive iron gates of the estate, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. I did not shed a single tear. I just felt a profound sense of clarity. I am sitting here now in the living room of my own penthouse apartment, looking out at the glittering Atlanta skyline. The amber liquid in my crystal glass catches the warm light of the room as I take a slow, measured sip of my favorite aged bourbon. It has been exactly 1 week since that night. 1 week since my husband threw me out like garbage and told me I was nothing. He thought he had completely destroyed me. He thought I left that mansion broken, humiliated, and completely empty-handed. He thought he was the smartest man in the world because he had managed to kick out his working-class wife the very second his mother died. He was so proud of himself for executing his cruel little plan. But what Julian did not know was that I had not spent the last week just planning a funeral. I had spent it doing exactly what I do best. I had been auditing. I had meticulously combed through every single ledger, every bank statement, and every hidden account associated with Hayes Holdings. Julian thought I was crying over a fake ring and a lost marriage. He did not know what was actually packed inside the secure, hidden lining of my navy blue suitcase. He did not know that I had taken the master encrypted hard drives containing the entire financial truth of the Hayes Empire. He kicked me out without reading the documents, and tomorrow morning at the official will reading, he is going to find out exactly why that was the biggest mistake of his entire life. To truly understand how completely blind Julian and his family were to their own downfall, you have to understand exactly what happened 2 days before he threw me out. The day we buried Vivian Hayes was an absolute masterclass in performative grief. Vivian was a towering legend in the Atlanta commercial real estate scene. She built her massive empire from the ground up, and she demanded absolute excellence in everything she touched. She had pre-planned her own funeral with the exact same ruthless precision she used to negotiate multi-million-dollar property deals. But the moment she took her last breath, her own children treated her meticulously planned homegoing service like a VIP nightclub event. The funeral was held at one of the largest and most historic megachurches in the city. There were hundreds of attendees, including local politicians, wealthy business moguls, and the absolute upper crust of the black elite. While the Hayes family was supposed to be mourning, I was the only person actually making sure the entire massive production did not completely fall apart. I was running on exactly 3 hours of sleep and entirely too much black coffee. My feet were throbbing in my black heels as I rapidly paced the heavy carpeted floors of the church lobby. I was constantly coordinating with the lead funeral director, making sure the towering floral arrangements of imported white orchids were positioned exactly according to Vivian's strict blueprints. I was managing the aggressive high-end catering staff, instructing the choir director on the musical cues, and firmly filtering out the relentless press photographers trying to sneak into the private family sanctuary. I was carrying the entire weight of the Hayes family legacy on my shoulders, while the actual blood relatives did absolutely nothing. While I was fiercely negotiating with a difficult florist who brought the wrong shade of roses, I caught sight of my sister-in-law, Chloe. Chloe was 32 years old, but she still behaved like a spoiled teenager who had just been handed her father's unlimited black credit card. She had actually shown up to her own mother's funeral wearing a custom designer gown that belonged on the red carpet of the Met Gala. It was a skin-tight black velvet dress with a plunging neckline, sheer side panels, and a dramatic sweeping train that dragged heavily across the polished church floor. She looked absolutely ridiculous and entirely inappropriate. But Chloe did not care about showing respect to the woman who gave her everything. She only cared about her audience. She was standing near the grand entrance, holding her latest smartphone up high on a gold-plated ring light tripod that she had literally brought to a funeral. She was streaming live on Instagram to her thousands of followers. I watched in absolute disgust as she pressed her perfectly manicured fingers to her completely dry eyes, pretending to wipe away invisible tears. She was putting on an Oscar-worthy performance for the camera, talking in a shaky, fragile voice about how heartbroken she was, and how she was the only one who truly understood her mother's brilliant and heavy legacy. She paused her fake sobbing every few seconds to break character and read the live comments, checking her engagement metrics and adjusting her lighting angles. She was actively using her mother's extravagant casket as a literal backdrop for brand sponsorships and social media clout. It was deeply embarrassing, but nobody in the family dared to stop her because they were all too busy playing their own twisted games. And then there was my loving husband, Julian. As the only son and the heir apparent to the Hayes Empire, he was supposed to be standing at the front of the church, greeting the highly influential guests who had flown in to pay their respects. He was supposed to be representing the strength and continuity of the family business. Instead, he was tucked away in a dimly lit alcove near the coat check, completely ignoring the long line of dignitaries waiting to speak with him. He was not alone. He was standing entirely too close to a 23-year-old woman named Amber. Amber was officially hired 3 months ago as his executive assistant, but everyone in the family knew exactly what her real job title was. She was wearing a sheer tight black dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination, and she was giggling softly at something Julian had just whispered in her ear. He had one hand casually resting on the small of her back, completely unbothered by the fact that hundreds of his mother's closest friends and colleagues were walking past them. He was not mourning the profound loss of the woman who provided his luxurious lifestyle. He was just eagerly killing time, waiting for the dirt to be thrown on her grave so he could finally access her bank accounts. I walked over to the alcove, my heavy clipboard in hand, and my patience completely evaporated. I cleared my throat loudly, causing Amber to jump slightly and take a quick, guilty step back. Julian did not even flinch. He just rolled his eyes and let out a heavy, annoyed sigh, like I was a nagging mother interrupting his fun play date. I told him the mayor of Atlanta was currently waiting in the main sanctuary to offer his personal condolences, and that he needed to stop hiding in the hallway and actually act like the head of the family. Julian sneered at me, slowly adjusting his expensive silk tie. He told me to go handle the mayor myself because that was exactly what I was good for. He looked at my clipboard and laughed, calling me the family secretary. He told me to stay out of his business and focus on making sure the food was hot. He then turned his back to me, completely dismissing my presence, and went right back to whispering and smiling with Amber. I stood there in the echoing hallway, looking at my husband and my sister-in-law, treating the darkest day of our family history like an incredibly fun luxury vacation. They were both so deeply entitled and incredibly arrogant. They genuinely believed that the Hayes name alone would automatically protect them from any real responsibility. They thought the vast family fortune would just magically flow into their hands forever, without requiring any actual work discipline or basic competence. They looked at me like I was the hired help, a temporary nuisance they merely tolerated. They were completely blind to the fact that I was the only person keeping the entire structure from collapsing around them. I did not argue with Julian. I simply turned around and went back to coordinating the funeral, tucking that final, agonizing moment of disrespect away into my mind, knowing that their reckoning was rapidly approaching. To understand why I remained so calm while my husband and his sister disgraced our family name, you have to go back exactly 1 month before the funeral. I already knew exactly who they were. I knew because the great Vivian Hayes told me herself. It was late on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting in a sterile, high-security VIP suite at Emory University Hospital. The room smelled faintly of bleach and the expensive floral arrangements that various local politicians had sent. Vivian was lying in the center of the massive hospital bed. The aggressive cancer had ravaged her body over the past 6 months, turning a formidable real estate titan into a fragile shadow of her former self. But while her body was rapidly failing, her mind remained as incredibly sharp and ruthless as ever. Julian and Chloe had already left the hospital for the day. Julian claimed he had urgent business meetings, which I later found out was just code for taking Amber to a luxury hotel downtown. Chloe had complained that the fluorescent hospital lighting was ruining her complexion and giving her a severe migraine, so she rushed off to a high-end spa. I was the only one left sitting in the uncomfortable leather guest chair next to Vivian's bed. I was quietly reviewing the quarterly tax projections on my tablet when Vivian suddenly reached out. Her hand was shockingly cold, and her grip was surprisingly strong. She wrapped her thin, bony fingers around my wrist and pulled my arm down. She looked at me with those piercing, dark eyes. She told me to turn off the screen and listen to her very carefully. Her voice was raspy and weak, but it still carried the heavy, commanding authority of a CEO who was used to absolute obedience. I placed the tablet on the bedside table and leaned in closer to hear her. Vivian took a slow, painful breath. She looked toward the empty doorway of her hospital room and let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Look at my grand legacy, Zuri, she whispered. Look at the absolute royalty I have produced. My son is currently sleeping with his assistant while his mother is dying. My daughter is more concerned about her pores than my plummeting oxygen levels. I tried to offer a polite, comforting lie. I quietly told her they were just grieving in their own ways and that they truly loved her. Vivian squeezed my wrist so hard it actually sent a jolt of pain up my arm. She told me to stop insulting her intelligence. She said she did not build an $80 million empire by entertaining comfortable lies, and she certainly was not going to start on her deathbed. They are parasites, Zuri, she said, her voice suddenly dropping into a low, venomous hiss. They are beautiful, useless parasites who have spent their entire adult lives feeding off my hard work. I gave them absolutely everything. I gave them the elite private schools, the massive trust funds, the luxury cars, and the unearned executive titles. I thought I was protecting them from the bitter struggle I had to go through when I started, but instead, I just made them incredibly weak. I raised two people who do not know the value of a single dollar because they have never actually had to earn one. Vivian fell into a harsh and violent coughing fit. I quickly poured a cup of ice water from the plastic pitcher and held the straw to her dry lips. She took a small sip and immediately pushed the cup away, determined to finish what she desperately needed to say. She looked me dead in the eyes and started tearing off the carefully constructed masks of everyone in the family. She started with Julian. She told me Julian was a vain, arrogant fool who was entirely driven by his own massive ego. She said he lacked the basic discipline to run a neighborhood lemonade stand, let alone a massive commercial real estate firm. She knew he had been cheating on me for months. She knew he secretly resented me because my intelligence and my relentless work ethic constantly reminded him of his own deep insecurities and incompetence. Then she moved on to Chloe. Vivian called her own daughter a hollow, empty vessel. She said Chloe was nothing but a walking billboard for designer brands with absolutely zero substance or original thought beneath the expensive clothes. And then Vivian brought up Preston. Her eyes darkened with absolute disgust when she spoke his name. She called Preston a mediocre opportunist. She knew exactly what he was doing behind closed doors. She said he paraded around acting like a white savior to a wealthy black family while secretly trying to drain their accounts to fund his own pathetic, failed business ventures. She called him a complete fraud who was bleeding her daughter dry. I sat there in stunned silence, listening to the powerful matriarch of the family completely dismantle her own bloodline. I asked her why she was telling me all of this now when she should be resting. Vivian released my wrist and slowly reached under her heavy hospital blankets. She pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope and placed it firmly into my hands. She told me that she was telling me this because I was the only person in the entire family who actually possessed a spine. She said she watched me closely for the past 5 years. She watched me silently endure their subtle insults, their snide remarks about my working-class background, and their endless, suffocating arrogance. She saw how I handled the complex company audits with flawless precision. She recognized the exact same hunger and raw grit in me that she had relied on to build her massive empire from scratch. She looked at the heavy envelope resting in my hands. She told me that Julian was going to try to destroy me the second her heart stopped beating. She predicted his exact moves with terrifying accuracy. She said he would immediately try to kick me out and claim the throne because he fundamentally believed a wife from South Atlanta was beneath his new billionaire status. But I am not leaving my life's work in the hands of a parasite, Vivian said, her voice suddenly fierce and deeply resolute. Inside that envelope are the exact instructions for the estate lawyer. I have set a trap for my own son Zuri. I am giving him enough rope to hang himself entirely. When the time comes, you need to let him think he has completely won. Let him show his true, disgusting colors to the world. Let him throw you out. And then you walk into that boardroom and you take everything that rightfully belongs to you. She closed her eyes, looking completely exhausted, but entirely at peace with her brutal final decision. She told me I was the daughter she actually chose. She ordered me to protect the company and to show absolutely no mercy to any of them when the time came. That was the last meaningful conversation I ever had with Vivian Hayes. She slipped into a deep coma 2 days later and never woke up. So when Julian stood in our living room a month later and threw that fake diamond ring at my feet, I was not in shock because my heart was broken. I was in shock because Vivian's grim prediction had come true flawlessly. I took her envelope. I executed her final orders. And I silently prepared for the ultimate financial slaughter. The very night Vivian slipped into her coma, I drove back to the empty Buckhead estate. Julian was not home. He had told me he was staying at a luxury hotel near the hospital to be close to his mother, but I already knew he was with Amber. The massive house was dead quiet. I walked straight into my home office, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and sat down at my desk. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out the thick manila envelope Vivian had pressed into my hands just hours earlier. I broke the wax seal. Inside were the master administrative passwords to the entire Hayes Holdings server network and a legally binding document granting me full unrestricted access to audit the corporate accounts. I opened my laptop and went straight to work. I am a senior tax auditor. I spend my days dismantling complex financial webs for massive global corporations. Finding hidden money is not just my job, it is my absolute expertise. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and began pulling the digital ledgers. For the first few hours, everything looked exactly as it should. The commercial properties were generating massive revenue. The liquid assets were properly diversified. Vivian had run a remarkably tight ship, protecting her empire from every possible external threat. But right around 2 in the morning, I noticed a glaring discrepancy hidden deep inside the personal asset portfolio. It was tied directly to the family mansion, the exact same house Chloe and Preston were currently living in rent-free. The mansion had been fully paid off 30 years ago. It was the absolute crown jewel of the Hayes personal estate. But according to the secure bank ledger I was looking at, there was a massive new liability secretly attached to the property. A $5 million commercial mortgage had been approved and fully funded. My eyes narrowed at the bright computer screen. Vivian absolutely despised debt. She would never take out a massive mortgage on a fully owned property, especially not while she was fighting terminal cancer. I immediately dug into the secure digital archives to pull the original loan origination documents. I downloaded the heavy PDF file and scrolled down to the final page to check the authorization signature. There it was. Vivian Hayes signed in her familiar, elegant cursive. But my blood ran completely cold when I looked at the digital timestamp right next to the signature. The loan had been finalized and digitally signed exactly 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Vivian was heavily sedated and lying in an intensive care unit. She did not even have the physical strength to hold a glass of water, let alone authorize a massive commercial real estate loan. It was a complete forgery, a ghost loan. Someone had used her high-level administrative credentials to bypass the standard banking protocols because the local bank president was an old family friend who approved the transaction on blind trust. I did not stop there. A forged signature was a major federal crime, but I needed to know exactly where that $5 million actually went. I tracked the routing numbers through the corporate banking portal. The bank had wired the full amount to a newly formed holding company called Sterling Future Ventures. My jaw clenched tightly. Sterling. It was Preston. My mediocre, highly arrogant white brother-in-law had actively preyed on his dying mother-in-law. While Chloe was busy buying designer bags and complaining about hospital lighting, her husband was secretly bleeding her own family dry. I spent the next 3 hours forensically tracing the money out of his holding company. I expected to find the stolen funds sitting securely in an offshore account, or maybe tied up in a risky real estate development project. But what I found was far more pathetic and incredibly reckless. Preston had wired the entire $5 million into a series of unregulated overseas cryptocurrency exchanges. He had taken the pure equity from the historical house his wife slept in and dumped it all into highly volatile altcoins and extremely risky leveraged derivatives. He was trying to play the role of a genius Wall Street day trader. But the financial records showed the brutal truth. The crypto market had taken a massive dive the very week after he bought in. He got margin called by the exchange. His high-risk positions were completely liquidated. The $5 million was not just hidden, it was entirely gone. It had evaporated into thin air. I sat back in my leather office chair and stared blankly at the glowing monitor. The silence of the dark house felt incredibly heavy. Preston was constantly putting on a show of pure superiority. He paraded around our family gatherings making snide microaggressions about my working-class background. He acted like the ultimate gatekeeper and protector of the Hayes legacy while looking down his nose at me. But in reality, he was nothing but a desperate, cornered criminal. He had committed severe wire fraud and identity theft. If the bank ever found out, they would immediately foreclose on the mansion, leaving Chloe completely homeless, and throw Preston straight into a federal penitentiary. I did not panic. I did not call the police. I did not even wake Julian up to tell him his arrogant brother-in-law was a common thief. I simply smiled, a cold, calculated smile in the total darkness of my office. I highlighted every single fraudulent transaction. I downloaded the forged signature documents, cross-referencing them with Vivian's official hospital medical records to prove she was incapacitated on that exact date. I took high-resolution screenshots of the routing numbers linking the Hayes estate directly to the failed crypto exchange accounts. I compiled every single piece of undeniable evidence into one highly encrypted file. Preston truly thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought the Hayes family fortune was an endless piggy bank he could steal from without anyone ever noticing his quiet crimes. He felt invincible because he assumed the rest of the family was too rich and too lazy to ever check the actual paperwork. But he forgot that a highly trained tax auditor was sitting right across the dinner table from him every single Sunday. I backed up the encrypted file onto my secure physical hard drive. I now held the absolute power to destroy his entire life and lock him in a prison cell, and I was going to use it at the exact perfect moment. The glowing screen illuminated my face in the dark silence of my home office. Having the undeniable evidence of Preston's massive wire fraud was incredibly powerful, but it was simply not enough to protect Vivian's entire legacy. Preston was just a symptom of the disease infecting the Hayes family. Julian was the actual virus. I needed to build an impenetrable digital fortress around the remaining family assets before my husband could even think about getting his greedy hands on them. I pulled up the Master Administrative Control Panel for Hayes Holdings. Vivian had given me the absolute highest level of security clearance, overriding even the senior board of directors. With a few rapid and deliberate keystrokes, I initiated a complete financial lockdown on all liquid capital accounts. I froze the massive commercial operating funds, tying them strictly to mandatory payroll and essential building maintenance. No luxury company cars could be leased, no executive bonuses could be issued, no special dividends could be quietly paid out to family members. I implemented a secondary dual authentication protocol for any single transfer over $10,000, explicitly linking the final approval directly to my personal biometric signature. If Julian or Preston tried to move even a single dime to cover their tracks or fund their lavish lifestyles, the system would automatically deny the transaction and send a direct security alert to my phone. I was completely severing their financial oxygen supply without them even realizing they had stopped breathing. They were going to wake up as multimillionaires on paper, but they would not be able to buy a cup of coffee without my direct permission. But digital firewalls can always be challenged by expensive corporate lawyers. I needed physical, undeniable proof that could never be wiped remotely by some highly paid IT fixer Julian might hire to break into the system. I reached into the locked bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a military-grade encrypted solid-state drive. It was a heavy block of cold black metal. I plugged it into the secure terminal and began the massive data transfer. I copied 7 years of flawless corporate tax returns, the forged signature files, the cryptocurrency exchange, routing numbers, and the exact medical records proving Vivian was entirely comatose when Preston stole the $5 million. I sat back and watched the green progress bar slowly fill across the screen. The only sound in the massive empty house was the quiet hum of my computer fan. When the data transfer finally hit 100%, I safely ejected the drive. The metallic click sounded incredibly loud in the silent room. I walked over to my master closet and pulled out my favorite navy blue designer suitcase. I carefully unzipped the interior silk lining and slid the heavy metal drive deep inside, pressing it flat against the reinforced polycarbonate frame. I zipped the lining back up, rendering the drive completely invisible to the naked eye. That small metal box was the ultimate weapon. It was the absolute destruction of my husband's entire empire, resting quietly at the bottom of my luggage. I knew exactly what Julian was planning to do the moment Vivian was put into the ground. He thought he was playing a brilliant and secretive game of chess, but his arrogant mind was completely transparent to me. I actually spent the morning of the funeral carefully packing my most essential clothing and personal documents into those two navy blue suitcases. I intentionally left them sitting out near the edge of my closet, knowing Julian would eagerly grab them and throw them out the second I left the house to go to the cemetery. When I walked into the grand foyer that evening and saw those bags sitting on the cold stone steps of the front porch, I was not a devastated, heartbroken wife realizing her marriage was over. I was a senior tax auditor verifying that my target had fallen perfectly into the trap. Julian had handed me my luggage with a smug, cruel smile, completely unaware that he was personally carrying the exact instrument of his own financial execution out the front door for me. He thought he was banishing a working-class peasant from his elite castle. He did not know he was personally handing the executioner her axe. When I drove away that night, leaving the fake diamond ring on the floor, I was not retreating. I was just taking my position on the battlefield. That brings us to right now. Exactly 1 week has passed since Julian threw me out into the cold Atlanta night. The morning air downtown is crisp and incredibly sharp. I step out of the back of my hired black car and look up at the towering glass and steel skyscraper housing the prestigious law offices of Montgomery and Associates. Elijah Montgomery is the most feared and respected estate lawyer in the entire state of Georgia, and he was Vivian's closest professional confidant. He is the man tasked with executing her final brutal will and testament. I am not wearing the dark conservative mourning clothes they expect to see me in. I am wearing a perfectly tailored emerald green silk suit with sharp, powerful shoulders and flawless matching heels. I do not look like a discarded charity case begging for a divorce settlement. I look exactly like the chief executive officer of an $80 million empire. I adjust the strap of my leather briefcase, taking a deep, steadying breath of the cold city air. I can already picture Julian sitting upstairs in the heavy mahogany boardroom. He is probably laughing arrogantly with his young mistress Amber and high-fiving his criminal brother-in-law Preston. Chloe is probably complaining about the quality of the complimentary coffee. They truly believe today is their royal coronation. They think they are about to be handed the keys to the kingdom, so they can finally run wild without Vivian's strict oversight. I push through the heavy revolving glass doors of the lobby and walk confidently toward the private elevator bank. The mourning period is officially over. The trap is perfectly set. The game has begun. The private elevator doors slid open silently, depositing me onto the top floor of Montgomery and Associates. The air up here smelled of rich, polished mahogany, expensive leather, and old money. I walked down the long corridor toward the main conference room, my emerald heels sinking slightly into the plush custom carpet. Through the heavy glass double doors, I could already see the absolute circus that was waiting for me. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. The boardroom was magnificent, dominated by a massive solid oak table that stretched 20 feet long across the center of the room. Large floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Atlanta skyline, but the elegance of the space was completely ruined by the people sitting inside it. Chloe and Preston had positioned themselves near the front window, basking in the morning sunlight like absolute royalty. Chloe had the sheer audacity to place a brand new Himalayan Birkin bag directly in the center of the polished wood table. It was an incredibly rare handbag, crafted from crocodile skin that cost upwards of $200,000 on the secondary market. You do not just walk into a boutique and buy that bag. You have to spend millions to even be offered the chance to see it. She was casually tracing the exotic white and gray leather with her manicured finger, making sure everyone in the room noticed her new ultimate status symbol. Preston was sitting right next to her, leaning back in his heavy leather executive chair with his shirt sleeves deliberately rolled up to his elbows. He was aggressively flashing a factory-new platinum Rolex Daytona. The watch still had that blinding out-of-the-box shine. It was painfully obvious what the two of them had done. The moment Vivian flatlined in her hospital bed, they had immediately opened massive high-interest bridge loans against their anticipated inheritance. They were already spending millions of dollars before the lawyer's ink had even dried. But the ultimate display of disrespect was sitting right at the head of the table. Julian had assumed the dominant seat traditionally reserved for the patriarch of the family. And sitting right next to him, with her hand resting intimately on his thigh, was Amber. My husband had actually brought his 23-year-old mistress to the official reading of his mother's last will and testament. Amber was loudly chewing a piece of pink gum and scrolling mindlessly through her phone, looking completely bored. She was wearing a tight designer dress that looked like it had been bought that very morning with Julian's black card. Julian looked up from his conversation as I entered the room. He did not look embarrassed or guilty about having his mistress sitting there. He just looked deeply annoyed. He let out a loud, dramatic sigh and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Why are you even here, Zuri?" he asked, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "I told you a week ago the Charity Act was completely over. My lawyer already couriered your divorce papers to whatever cheap motel you are currently staying at. You are not getting a single dime of my family money." I did not let my gaze falter. I walked slowly into the room, projecting absolute confidence and total calm. "I received an official legal summons from the executor of the estate," Julian I replied, my voice perfectly level. "As long as I am still legally recognized as a member of this family, I am required by state law to be present in this room." Chloe scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "Legal technicalities," she muttered loudly to Preston, ensuring her voice carried across the room. "She is just hoping Mom left her a tiny pity check for putting up with Julian for the past 5 years. Grab a seat in the back, Zuri, and try not to interrupt the adults. We have a very busy day of celebrating ahead of us. We are flying out to St. Bart's tonight, and we do not have time for your little desperate guilt trips." I looked down at the seating arrangement. Julian, Amber, Chloe, and Preston had clustered tightly at the very top of the table, forming a united wall of pure greed. The remaining chairs near them were deliberately pulled out and angled away, creating a physical barrier. They were intentionally forcing me to sit at the absolute furthest end of the 20-foot table near the exit doors. They wanted me physically isolated. They wanted me to feel small, insignificant, and completely powerless in the face of their newly acquired wealth. I walked the length of the room and gracefully took the seat at the far opposite end of the table. I placed my leather briefcase down with a soft, authoritative click. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly down the length of the wood at the four of them. From this vantage point, they looked exactly like a pack of starving vultures fighting over a fresh carcass. They were laughing with each other, whispering inside jokes, and pointing out the window at a luxury car dealership across the street, openly discussing what exotic vehicles they were going to purchase that afternoon. I sat there in total silence, watching them enthusiastically count their unhatched chickens. I looked at Chloe's $200,000 bag bought with phantom money. I looked at Preston's platinum watch, resting on the wrist of a man who had secretly stolen $5 million and lost it all in the crypto market. I looked at Amber's smug expression as she leaned her head on my husband's expensive suit jacket, dreaming of a penthouse lifestyle she would never actually get to live. They were so completely drunk on the illusion of sudden endless wealth that they had lost all connection to reality. They truly believed that $80 million was just going to fall directly from the sky into their laps with absolutely no conditions, no taxes, and no oversight. They did not know about the massive debt Preston was hiding from his wife. They did not know about the strict digital lockdown I had initiated on the corporate accounts the night before. And they certainly did not know about the encrypted hard drive currently sitting safely in a highly secure bank vault under my name. I let them have their fleeting moment of extreme arrogance. I let Julian whisper in Amber's ear, making massive promises of yachts and endless shopping sprees. I let Chloe snap a quick, perfectly filtered photo of her Birkin bag for her social media followers. I allowed them to climb to the absolute highest peak of their delusional mountain, because I knew exactly what was coming next. The higher they climbed, the more completely devastating their inevitable fall was going to be. The heavy oak door at the front of the room suddenly clicked open, and the low murmur of their arrogant conversations instantly died down. Elijah Montgomery stepped into the boardroom. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s, wearing a flawless charcoal three-piece suit. He carried a thick leather-bound portfolio under his arm, and his expression was as incredibly serious as a judge preparing to deliver a life sentence. He walked straight past Julian without offering a single handshake or a word of condolence. He took his place standing near the exact center of the long table, placing the heavy portfolio down with a loud thud that echoed sharply through the quiet room. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the greedy faces staring back at him. The mourning period was over, and the real game was finally ready to begin. Elijah Montgomery did not even bother opening the thick leather portfolio right away. He simply stood at the head of the long oak table, folding his hands together, looking at the group with an expression of deep professional exhaustion. Before he could even utter a single formal greeting, Chloe dramatically slammed her hand down on the table. The sudden noise made her $200,000 Birkin bag shake slightly. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly across the length of the room at me. "Elijah, I'm going to stop you right there," Chloe announced, her voice shrill and echoing loudly in the spacious boardroom. "Why is she still sitting here? Julian already filed the divorce papers. She has absolutely no legal right to be in this room while we discuss my mother's private estate. Look at her sitting down there in that ridiculous green suit, trying to look like she is the one running a Fortune 500 company. It is completely pathetic. Tell security to escort her out so we can get to the money." Elijah slowly adjusted his glasses, staring at Chloe with a mixture of pity and intense irritation. He informed her in a perfectly flat, monotone voice that under state law, all legal spouses must be present for the preliminary reading of any major estate unless a finalized divorce decree has already been signed by a judge. Since Julian had only filed the initial paperwork yesterday morning, I was still legally recognized as his wife. Therefore, my presence was entirely mandatory. Julian scoffed loudly, wrapping his arm tighter around his mistress Amber, who was busy blowing a bubble with her pink gum. But before Julian could open his mouth to complain, his brother-in-law Preston decided it was the perfect time to showcase his absolute brilliance. Preston leaned far over the heavy wooden table, resting his elbows on the polished surface. He looked down the length of the room at me with a sickeningly sweet, patronizing smile. It was the exact same look a frustrated teacher gives a particularly slow child who just cannot grasp a simple math problem. "Now, Zuri, let us just be completely reasonable here," Preston said, his tone dripping with thick, heavy condescension. "I know you are an accountant, and you are very good at crunching basic numbers for regular people. But corporate estate law is a completely different beast, and I do not want you getting your hopes up over some misguided fantasy. I understand you probably spent all night searching online for divorce settlements, hoping to secure a nice, comfortable payday to carry you back to your little neighborhood in South Atlanta." He paused to take a slow, arrogant sip from a crystal glass of water, acting like he was delivering a masterclass lecture. "Let me educate you on how things actually work in the great state of Georgia," Preston continued. "Georgia is an equitable distribution state. That means marital assets are divided fairly in a divorce. However, inheritance is legally classified as separate non-marital property. The $80 million Vivian left behind belongs exclusively to Julian and Chloe. It does not go into the joint marital pot. It is completely shielded from any desperate greedy spouses trying to secure a quick retirement fund. So even though the old lawyer here is forcing you to sit in that chair, you are legally entitled to absolutely nothing, not a single cent. You are wasting your time and quite frankly, you are wasting ours. Julian laughed loudly at Preston's amateur legal lecture. He gave Preston a firm, approving nod, clearly thrilled that someone else was doing the dirty work of putting me in my place. "See, Zuri," Julian called out from the top of the table. "Even my brother-in-law understands the law better than you do. You thought you could just sit there looking sharp and intimidating waiting for a handout. You are walking away with the exact same amount of money you brought into this family 5 years ago. Absolutely zero." The entire room fell completely silent, waiting for my reaction. Chloe had her phone resting on the table, hoping to catch a humiliating emotional breakdown she could mock later. Amber finally stopped chewing her gum, looking at me with a smug, satisfied smirk. They were all waiting for the explosion. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to cry about how unfair the law was. They wanted me to throw a desperate temper tantrum proving that I was exactly the uncultured gold digger they had always claimed I was. But I did not give them a single reaction. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the long mahogany table. My hands remained neatly folded, resting on top of my leather briefcase. My facial expression was completely locked into a mask of total professional indifference. I looked right past Julian, right past Chloe, and locked my eyes directly onto Preston. The sheer, profound irony of the moment was almost too heavy to bear. Here was an arrogant, mediocre man wearing a brand new platinum Rolex bought with phantom money lecturing me on the strict boundaries of the law. This was a man who had secretly committed massive wire fraud, forged the signature of a dying woman on a $5 million commercial mortgage, and lost every single penny of it on a failed cryptocurrency gamble. He was currently staring down the barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence for identity theft and bank fraud. Yet he felt completely confident sitting in a luxury boardroom condescendingly explaining property law to a senior corporate tax auditor. He thought he was wielding the law like a weapon against me to protect his own future fortune. He had absolutely no idea that the law was actually a tightening noose already wrapped firmly around his own neck. He did not know about the strict digital lockdown I had initiated, sealing off the very accounts he planned to steal from next. He did not know about the encrypted hard drive currently resting inside a secure bank vault. My continued absolute silence began to make the room slightly uncomfortable. Preston's smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. It is deeply unsettling when you throw your heaviest punch at someone, and they do not even bother to flinch. They expected a victim who would argue and scream for her dignity. But they were looking at an executioner waiting patiently for her turn to strike. Elijah Montgomery watched my silent, stoic reaction from the center of the room. A very faint, almost imperceptible smile ghosted across the old lawyer's weathered face. He knew exactly what Vivian had planned, and he knew exactly why I was sitting there so quietly. He cleared his throat loudly, shattering the heavy tension in the room. He reached down, unclasped the heavy brass locks on his leather portfolio, and flipped it open, ready to finally read the document that would destroy them all. Elijah Montgomery did not look at Julian when he finally broke the heavy wax seal on the leather portfolio. He did not look at Chloe or Preston. His tired, aged eyes flicked briefly down the length of the long mahogany table and locked directly onto mine for a fraction of a second. It was a silent acknowledgement between two people who knew exactly what was about to happen. Then he cleared his throat. It was a deep, resonant sound that demanded absolute silence in the room. The ambient noise of the Atlanta city traffic outside the thick glass windows seemed to fade away completely. The heavy, suffocating tension in the boardroom was palpable. Julian leaned forward in his heavy executive chair, practically vibrating with eager anticipation. He looked like a starving wild animal staring at a piece of raw meat. Chloe gripped the handles of her absurdly expensive Himalayan Birkin bag so tightly that her knuckles were turning completely white. Even Preston stopped checking his factory new platinum watch and sat up straight, smoothing his pastel polo shirt. Before I read the formal declarations of the deceased, I must inform all parties present that Vivian Hayes left very specific and highly rigid instructions regarding the execution of this document, Elijah began. His voice projected across the room with the practiced authority of a man who had navigated billionaires through their absolute worst family crises. This is a binding legal testament. There is no room for negotiation, and there is absolutely no room for interpretation. I expect everyone in this room to maintain the utmost decorum out of respect for Vivian's legacy. Julian rolled his eyes and let out a heavy dramatic sigh. Just read the paper, Elijah, he interrupted impatiently loudly, tapping his fingers against the polished wood table. We all know my mother was a demanding perfectionist. Let us just get past the boring legal preamble and get directly to the bottom line so we can all move on with our lives and you can finally collect your exorbitant billing hours. Elijah stared at Julian with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He slowly turned the thick parchment paper over, flattening it out on the table, and began to read the first page aloud. I, Vivian Hayes, being of sound mind and absolute clarity of purpose, do hereby declare this document to be my final will and testament. Elijah read, his voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. I have spent my entire life building an empire from the ground up, and it is my final wish to secure the future of the Hayes family name. Therefore, to my only son, Julian Hayes, I leave the entirety of my primary commercial real estate portfolio, known officially as Hayes Holdings. This includes all active commercial properties, all pending developmental contracts, and all associated liquid capital currently resting in the primary corporate bank accounts. Elijah paused for a moment, letting the heavy legal jargon settle over the room before delivering the ultimate punchline they had all been desperately waiting for. At the time of my death, the total valuation of these corporate shares and liquid assets is definitively appraised at $80 million. I hereby transfer 100% of this aforementioned wealth directly to my son Julian. The exact moment the words $80 million left Elijah's mouth, the entire boardroom completely exploded into absolute chaotic madness. Julian leaped out of his heavy leather executive chair, knocking it backwards so forcefully that it crashed loudly against the glass wall behind him. He threw both of his hands high up into the air, clenching his fists like a professional athlete who had just won a championship game. He let out a loud, triumphant roar that echoed violently off the walls of the elegant room. Chloe shrieked at the absolute top of her lungs. It was a piercing, ear-splitting sound of pure, greedy ecstasy. She grabbed her new designer handbag and hugged it tightly to her chest, jumping up and down in her designer high heels, completely ignoring the fact that she was currently attending a legal proceeding regarding her dead mother. Preston slammed his hands down on the mahogany table, letting out a loud, booming laugh, and immediately reached across the table to aggressively high-five Julian. They were cheering and hollering, completely abandoning any shred of basic human dignity or respect. Amber, the 23-year-old mistress, who had absolutely no right to even be in the building, practically threw herself onto Julian. She wrapped her thin arms tightly around his neck and kissed him passionately, loudly congratulating him on becoming a certified multimillionaire. Julian grabbed her by the waist and spun her around, completely intoxicated by the massive, unimaginable wealth that had just been legally handed to him on a silver platter. I sat completely motionless at the far end of the long table, entirely isolated from their obnoxious and deeply embarrassing celebration. I watched my husband behaving like a feral animal. I watched his sister crying genuine tears of joy over money she had absolutely not earned. I watched his brother-in-law celebrating the exact fortune he was currently actively trying to steal from. It was an absolute masterclass in human greed and utter delusion. Julian suddenly stopped spinning Amber and turned his attention directly toward the back of the room. He pointed his finger straight at me, his face flushed red with manic excitement and arrogance. "Did you hear that, Zuri?" He yelled over the noise, his voice echoing down the length of the long mahogany table. $80 million. I am a king today. And you get absolutely nothing. You are walking out of this building with the exact same cheap clothes you walked in with. They were all so completely blinded by the sheer massive number that they completely stopped paying attention to their surroundings. $80 million is a phrase that instantly shuts down all rational thought in a greedy mind. Julian genuinely believed he had just been handed the absolute keys to the kingdom. He thought he was completely invincible. He thought he could finally fund his extravagant lifestyle, buy his young mistress a luxury penthouse, and completely erase my existence from his personal history without any consequences whatsoever. He was so incredibly busy popping an imaginary bottle of champagne that he completely missed the heavy, suffocating silence that had suddenly fallen over the other end of the table. He was so busy gloating and kissing Amber that he did not bother to look back at Elijah Montgomery. The old estate lawyer had not closed the heavy leather portfolio. He had not offered a single word of professional congratulations. He simply stood there at the head of the table, adjusting his gold-rimmed reading glasses and waiting patiently for the absolute circus to calm down so he could finish his job. Julian did not just want to celebrate his sudden massive wealth. He wanted to completely destroy me in the process. He pulled away from Amber's embrace and began walking slowly down the length of the massive mahogany table. His expensive Italian leather shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor with every step he took. The entire room went completely quiet as he approached me. Chloe stopped giggling, and Preston sat up straight, eager to watch the final execution. Julian stopped just a few feet away from my chair. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, venomous hatred. His face was flushed with the manic energy of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world. "Look at you, Zuri," he whispered loudly, his voice dripping with intense cruelty. "Look at how completely pathetic you are right now. You really thought you were going to walk out of here with a massive settlement, did you not? You thought you were actually going to be rewarded for all your hard work." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed violently against the glass windows of the boardroom. "You gave me the absolute best years of your youth." Julian continued, stepping even closer so he could look directly into my eyes. "You spent your late 20s and your early 30s playing the perfect, obedient little wife. You spent your weekends fetching coffee for my mother, organizing our family retreats, and balancing our checkbooks. You worked 80-hour weeks while I was out on the golf course. You missed your own best friend's wedding just to negotiate a commercial lease agreement for a building you do not even own. You sacrificed your own happiness, your own free time, and your own sanity to build a massive fortress for someone else. And for what? What do you actually have to show for it today?" Julian pointed a sharp finger directly at my face. "You have absolutely nothing. You are sitting there in a cheap suit holding a worthless briefcase. You dedicated your entire life to pleasing a woman who never actually viewed you as anything more than an unpaid employee. You were just the hired help, Zuri. You were a temporary contractor we brought in to keep the corporate books clean because my mother knew you were desperate for a taste of the elite life. And now your contract has officially been terminated." He turned his head slightly, gesturing back toward the head of the table where Amber was sitting. "I have $80 million and a woman who actually knows how to enjoy my money," Julian said, a wicked smile spreading across his face. "And you are being thrown out like the absolute trash you always were. You can go back to your little working-class neighborhood in South Atlanta. You can tell all your broke friends that you almost made it. You can tell them you almost got your greedy hands on real generational wealth. But in the end, you just were not smart enough to secure the bag. You are nothing to me. You are nothing to this family. You are completely erased." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh of agreement from across the room. "It is honestly just sad to watch at this point," she chimed in, tracing the edge of her luxury handbag. "Just leave, Zuri, have some basic dignity, and walk out before you embarrass yourself any further." I sat perfectly still in my chair. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I did not let a single ounce of emotion break through the icy mask I was wearing. I let Julian's cruel, venomous words hang heavily in the cold air of the boardroom. He was performing for his audience. He was trying to assert his absolute dominance and break my spirit entirely. He wanted to see me crumble. He wanted to see me weep over the lost years of my youth and the brutal betrayal of my marriage. But my spirit was completely untouchable. Every single nasty insult he hurled at me only made the trap I had set that much tighter. Every single word of his arrogant monologue was just another shovelful of dirt he was throwing into his own financial grave. I was not a victim enduring a public humiliation. I was an auditor quietly observing a catastrophic failure right before it happened. Julian stared at me, waiting for my reaction. When I gave him absolutely nothing but a cold, deadpan stare, his wicked smile finally began to fade into a look of intense irritation. He hated that he could not make me cry. He hated that even with $80 million to his name, he still could not force me to bow down to him. "Get out of my building!" Zuri Julian commanded, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "The reading is over. Security is waiting down by the lobby elevators right now. If you do not stand up and walk out of that door in the next 5 seconds, I am going to have them come up here and drag you out by your hair." The room fell completely dead silent after his violent threat. Julian turned his back to me, ready to walk away in total victory. He was fully expecting to hear the sound of my chair pushing back and my footsteps running desperately toward the exit. He took exactly 2 steps toward his throne at the head of the table. Tap, tap, tap. A sharp metallic sound suddenly pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. Julian froze in his tracks. Chloe stopped admiring her bag. Preston narrowed his eyes. It was the sound of a heavy brass pen striking the solid mahogany wood. Elijah Montgomery was still standing at the absolute center of the long table. He had not moved an inch. He slowly reached up and took off his gold-rimmed reading glasses, carefully folding the arms and placing them neatly on top of the open leather portfolio. The old estate lawyer did not look at the signed paperwork. He looked directly at my husband. His weathered face was completely devoid of any amusement or patience. Julian, the old lawyer, said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet room like a freshly sharpened blade. "Have you turned to the second page yet?" Julian slowly lowered his hand, his triumphant smile hardening into a mask of pure, aggressive confusion. He looked at Elijah Montgomery, as if the old man had just spoken a completely different language. The heavy silence in the boardroom stretched out, feeling incredibly fragile and violently tense. "What the hell are you talking about, old man?" Julian finally snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. "I read the email summary you sent me yesterday. My mother left me the $80 million. You just read it out loud yourself. There is no second page. Hand me the document right now." Elijah did not flinch. He did not hand over the heavy leather portfolio. He simply picked up his gold-rimmed glasses, slid them back onto his face, and looked down at the parchment paper. "The email summary you received was a courtesy notification regarding the primary beneficiary status of the estate." Elijah explained, his tone completely professional and completely devoid of empathy. It was not the complete legal document. Vivian Hayes was a woman who built an empire on meticulous conditions. She did not simply hand over $80 million without ensuring the recipient was actually capable of managing it. Elijah slowly turned the heavy parchment paper over, revealing a second densely typed page filled with complex legal clauses and heavy black ink. Page 2, Section 4, Paragraph A. Elijah began reading aloud, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly dead quiet room. "While the entirety of Hayes Holdings is hereby bequeathed to my son Julian Hayes, the full $80 million valuation is immediately transferred into an irrevocable trust." Chloe gasped loudly, dropping her $200,000 Birkin bag onto the table. Preston suddenly sat up entirely straight, the color rapidly draining from his previously smug face. Even Amber stopped chewing her gum, recognizing the severe tone of the lawyer even if she did not fully understand the heavy legal terminology. Julian slammed his hands down on the mahogany table. A trust, he yelled, his face flushing an angry dark red. What do you mean a trust? I am 36 years old. I am not a child. I do not need a babysitter managing my own money. You are telling me I have to ask you for permission every time I want to make a withdrawal. Elijah looked over his glasses at my enraged husband. I am not the trustee, Julian the lawyer said calmly. I am merely the executor. But before we discuss who currently controls the trust, we need to discuss the specific conditions required for the funds to be released to you. Vivian was very explicit. She included a highly specific morality and marital clause deeply embedded into the foundation of the trust itself. Julian let out a harsh, humorless bark of a laugh. A morality clause, he scoffed, pacing slightly behind his heavy executive chair. What is this, the 19th century? What did my mother want me to do? Go to church every Sunday and volunteer at a soup kitchen? Cut the crap, Elijah, and tell me how I get my money. Elijah ignored the blatant disrespect and looked back down at the document. Section 4, paragraph B. Elijah continued, his voice cutting through Julian's arrogant tantrum like a knife. The primary beneficiary, Julian Hayes, shall only be granted access to the principal balance and the generated revenue of the trust under one strict, unconditional requirement. The beneficiary must remain legally married to and reside in continuous harmonious cohabitation with his current legal spouse, Zuri Hayes, for a minimum consecutive period of exactly 5 years following the date of my passing. The absolute silence that followed that sentence was so incredibly heavy, it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the massive boardroom. You could have heard a single pin drop on the thick carpet. Julian completely froze. He stood frozen behind his chair, his mouth slightly open, staring at Elijah as if the lawyer had just pulled a gun on him. Chloe let out a small, terrified whimper. Preston looked like he was about to physically vomit onto the polished mahogany table. Amber immediately pulled her hand away from Julian's thigh, her eyes darting nervously around the room. I sat at the far end of the long table, my hands still neatly folded over my leather briefcase. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just watched the absolute devastating reality of the situation slowly crash down onto my husband's head. Wait, Julian stammered, his voice suddenly losing all of its previous booming authority. Wait, that cannot be legal. You cannot force someone to stay married through a financial contract. That is extortion. That is a violation of my basic rights. I will take this to the Supreme Court if I have to. It is entirely legal in the state of Georgia, when structured within an irrevocable private trust. Elijah countered smoothly, his tone completely unbothered by Julian's empty threats. Your mother was not forcing you to stay married, Julian. She simply made it a strict condition of receiving her money. You are completely free to divorce Zuri whenever you please. But if you choose to end the marriage, or if you fail to maintain a harmonious living arrangement, the trust explicitly dictates that your status as the primary beneficiary is immediately permanently revoked. Julian stumbled backward slightly, his expensive Italian loafers catching on the thick carpet. He grabbed the back of his chair to steady himself. His eyes darted wildly toward me and then back to the lawyer. His chest was heaving as he desperately tried to calculate a way out of the massive steel trap his own mother had built for him. But I am the only son, he pleaded, his voice rising in high-pitched panic. I am the only male heir. If I do not get the money, who does? It has to go to me. If the marital clause is violated, the entirety of the $80 million trust is immediately liquidated. Elijah read, pointing a manicured finger at the bottom of the second page. 90% of the total assets will be permanently donated to a designated list of women's shelters and educational charities in the South Atlanta district. The remaining 10% will be legally awarded to Zuri Hayes as a compensatory severance package for her years of dedicated service to the Hayes family. Julian looked like he had just been struck by lightning. The $80 million he had been celebrating just 5 minutes ago, the exotic cars he was planning to buy, the luxury penthouse he was promising his young mistress, the massive global empire he thought he finally controlled, All of it was completely locked away behind a massive, impenetrable wall, and the only key to that wall was the exact same woman he had just violently thrown out of his house like garbage. He had spent the entire morning insulting me. He had paraded his mistress in front of me. He had allowed his sister and his brother-in-law to humiliate me and mock my working-class background. He had proudly told me I was completely erased from his history. He thought he was executing a flawless power move. He did not realize he was actively pressing the detonation button on his own life. Julian slowly turned his head to look down the length of the long table at me. The arrogant swagger was completely gone. The cruel, mocking smile had completely vanished. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror, realizing exactly what he had done. Julian stared at me for what felt like an eternity. His chest was rising and falling rapidly as his brain desperately tried to process the catastrophic mess he had just created. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He looked back at Elijah and forced a weak, trembling laugh. "But we are still married," Julian stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "We are legally married right now. I have not signed any final papers. A judge has not signed anything. We are still husband and wife, so the condition is met. The money is still mine. Give me the check, Elijah, and I will go home and work on my marriage." Elijah Montgomery did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. He reached back into his heavy leather portfolio and pulled out a thin stack of papers bound by a blue legal cover. He slid them across the polished mahogany table, stopping them right in front of Julian. "Are you quite sure about that, Julian Elijah?" asked his voice, incredibly dry. "Because according to this officially stamped document currently resting on the table, you initiated a formal legal separation." Julian looked down at the papers as if they were covered in poison. It was the petition for dissolution of marriage. The very same paperwork he had proudly bragged about sending to me just 20 minutes ago. "Under the specific and unalterable terms of your mother's irrevocable trust." Elijah continued reading from his own notes. "Any formal legal action taken by either party to dissolve the marriage acts as an immediate and permanent forfeiture of the primary beneficiary status." Furthermore, the clause explicitly prohibits the eviction, abandonment, or public humiliation of the spouse. When you filed this petition yesterday morning at the Fulton County Courthouse and subsequently removed Zuri from your shared marital residence, you automatically triggered the forfeiture protocol. Julian let out a strangled, gasping sound. He grabbed the blue folder with shaking hands, staring at the official red ink stamp from the county clerk. "No," he whispered, his eyes darting frantically across the text. "No, this was just a preliminary filing. It was just a warning. I can take it back. I will call the courthouse right now and withdraw the petition. I will tell the judge it was a massive misunderstanding. The trust does not care about your retractions, Julian," Elijah stated firmly, his tone carrying the heavy weight of finality. "The trust is a highly specific legal entity with zero margin for error." The absolute second the county clerk stamped that document yesterday morning, the breach was officially recorded. The $80 million instantly and permanently reverted to the secondary contingencies. You shot yourself in the foot, Julian, and there is absolutely no undoing it. The reality of his colossal mistake finally shattered his arrogant mind entirely. Julian completely lost whatever shred of dignity he had left. He slammed his fists onto the table so hard that the crystal water glasses rattled violently. "You set me up!" he screamed, his face contorting into an ugly mask of pure panic and rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Elijah. "You and my mother conspired against me. You purposely withheld this information to trick me into filing those papers. This is entrapment. I will sue you for legal malpractice. I will have you disbarred. I will drag this entire firm through the mud until you give me my money." Elijah remained completely unfazed by the violent outburst. He calmly placed his hands flat on the table and looked at Julian with an expression of deep, profound pity. I did not force you to cheat on your wife, Julian. I did not force you to parade your mistress into my law firm. I did not force you to pack your wife's belongings into suitcases and throw her out onto the street the very moment your mother died. You made every single one of those arrogant choices entirely on your own. Your mother simply knew exactly who you were. She knew you lacked the basic discipline to honor your vows when you thought nobody was holding you accountable. The trap was entirely of your own making. All you had to do to inherit $80 million was be a decent husband, and you could not even manage to do that for a single week. Julian stumbled backward, gasping for air like a drowning man. He spun around and looked wildly at his sister. Chloe was sitting perfectly still, her face completely drained of all color. She was staring blankly at her $200,000 designer handbag, suddenly realizing it was no longer a status symbol, but a massive, suffocating debt she could never repay. Preston had his face buried in his hands, quietly murmuring obscenities, as the reality of his own uncovered $5 million fraud crushed him. Julian then turned his desperate, manic eyes toward me. The cruel, venomous monster who had just mocked my working-class background and told me I was completely erased was suddenly gone. In his place was a pathetic, begging child. He rushed down the side of the long table, closing the distance between us. He fell to his knees right beside my chair, grabbing the fabric of my emerald green silk suit with both of his shaking hands. "Zuri, baby, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to help me fix this. You know I did not mean any of the things I just said. I was just grieving. I was stressed about the funeral. I was out of my mind with grief. You know how much I love you. We can go to the judge together right now. We can tell them we reconciled. We can tell Elijah we are happily married and living together. Please, Zuri, you cannot let them take everything from me." He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning his young mistress Amber, who was watching the entire pathetic display from the head of the table. He was weaponizing his fake tears, trying to use the 5 years of our marriage to manipulate my emotions. He thought I was still the obedient little wife who would swoop in and save him from his own disastrous consequences. He thought if he just cried hard enough, I would forget the ultimate disrespect he had shown me. I looked down at him kneeling on the floor. I did not pull my skirt away from his desperate grip. I just stared at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as solid ice. I let him cry. I let the man who had just told me I was completely erased from his history sob heavily into the fabric of my skirt. He was gripping my legs so tightly I could actually feel his hands shaking through the material. He looked up at me with those red, desperate eyes waiting for the soft and forgiving wife he had successfully manipulated for 5 years to magically reappear and save him from his own disastrous choices. He honestly believed that if he just put on a good enough performance, I would forget every single vicious insult he had hurled at me. But that forgiving woman was completely dead. She died the exact moment he threw that fake cubic zirconia ring at my feet and kicked me out of my own home. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream at him to get away from me. I simply reached down and gently peeled his trembling fingers off my clothing one by one. "Stand up, Julian," I said, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "Have some basic dignity. You are embarrassing yourself in front of your lawyer and your mistress." He scrambled backward, but remained on his knees on the thick carpet. He was breathing heavily, staring at me as if I was suddenly holding a loaded weapon. I slowly unclasped the brass buckles of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the painfully silent room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stapled packet of papers. It was stamped with the bright red official seal of the Fulton County Family Court. I did not hand it to him. I simply tossed it onto the polished mahogany table, letting it slide across the smooth surface until it stopped right next to his sweaty, trembling hand. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible and completely stripped of its previous booming arrogance. "That is the final confirmation receipt from the county clerk. I explained calmly, looking down at his pathetic form. You see, Julian, you were so incredibly eager to throw me out onto the street that you paid your aggressive divorce attorney a massive premium to expedite the filing process. You wanted to make sure the paperwork was aggressively pushed through the system the very second the courthouse doors opened yesterday morning. You wanted to completely humiliate me as fast as humanly possible. But in your desperate rush to assert your dominance, you failed to understand how the electronic legal filing system actually works. Julian stared at the packet of papers, but he was too terrified to actually pick it up. I continued my explanation, breaking down the harsh reality of his situation with the exact same clinical precision I used during a massive corporate audit. Once an expedited petition is digitally stamped and entered into the central court database, it immediately generates a permanent, irrevocable docket number. I said my words, hitting him like physical blows. It cannot simply be erased because you suddenly realized you made a catastrophic financial mistake. It cannot be quietly withdrawn without leaving a permanent digital footprint. The absolute second that docket number was generated by the clerk, the legal separation was formally recognized by the state. And much more importantly, it was instantly recognized by your mother's irrevocable trust. You broke the marital clause, Julian. The violation is permanently locked into the system. There is absolutely no turning back. Julian let out a low, agonizing groan that sounded like a wounded animal. He finally reached up and grabbed the papers, pulling them down to the floor. He frantically flipped through the pages, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text and the bold red stamps. He was desperately looking for a loophole. He was searching for a technicality that could somehow save his $80 million empire. But there was absolutely nothing. The paperwork was entirely flawless. His own highly paid, expensive lawyer had ensured that the filing was ironclad, completely sealing his catastrophic fate without even realizing it. He looked up at Elijah Montgomery, his face pale and completely covered in cold sweat. Elijah, he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Tell her we can fix this. You know the judges in this city. You have massive political connections. We can get a judge to strike the filing from the record. We can pretend it never happened. Elijah simply shook his head, his expression totally unyielding. The trust is governed by strict federal oversight due to the massive size of the commercial assets, Julian, the old lawyer, replied. No local county judge has the jurisdiction to overturn Vivian's explicit clauses or erase a federally recorded digital docket. The protocol has already been triggered. The funds are actively being diverted as we speak. You did this to yourself, I said, forcing Julian's panicked attention back to me. Just 20 minutes ago, you were standing right in front of me, laughing in my face. You told me I wasted my youth. You told me I was nothing but the hired help. You proudly bragged about how you were going to spend your millions with a woman who was sitting right next to you chewing gum while we discussed your dead mother. You wanted to be the absolute king of the Hayes Empire, Julian. But real kings actually read the treaties they sign. You were just a spoiled child playing dress-up in your mother's expensive clothes. Absolute profound despair finally settled over Julian's face. The frantic manic energy completely drained out of his body, leaving him hollow and entirely broken. He dropped the court documents onto the floor and buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, gut-wrenching sob. The $80 million was gone. The highly profitable commercial properties were gone. The endless liquid assets were gone. The lavish, unearned lifestyle he had enjoyed since the day he was born was completely evaporated. He was 36 years old, with absolutely no actual job skills, no personal savings, and massive credit card debt he had aggressively accumulated, anticipating this exact inheritance. I looked past Julian and glanced at the rest of the room. The shift in the atmosphere was incredibly dramatic and deeply satisfying. Amber, the 23-year-old mistress who had been clinging to Julian like a financial lifeline, suddenly realized that the golden ticket she thought she had punched was entirely worthless. She quietly reached down and picked up her cheap designer knockoff purse from the floor. She did not say a single word, She did not offer Julian a hug or a word of comfort. She simply turned around and slowly began inching her way toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. She slipped out the door and disappeared into the hallway, abandoning him the exact second the money vanished. Chloe and Preston were completely paralyzed in their seats. They were staring at Julian crying on the floor, suddenly realizing that their own financial lifelines had just been violently severed. They had banked everything on Julian's massive inheritance, bailing them out of their own reckless spending and secret massive debts. Now the vault was permanently sealed and the only key was completely destroyed. The reality of their absolute ruin was quietly settling over the room, suffocating them all. I stood up slowly from my chair at the far end of the long mahogany table. The sharp scrape of the wooden legs against the floor made Julian flinch. He was still kneeling on the carpet, his face red and stained with tears, mourning the loss of a massive fortune he had held for exactly 10 minutes. I walked over to where he was kneeling, looking down at him, not with anger, but with the cold clinical pity you might feel for a wounded insect. "You are crying over a fantasy, Julian," I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the large room. "You are mourning the loss of $80 million because you violated the trust. But the ultimate joke is that even if you had kept your vows, even if you had never filed those divorce papers, and even if you had played the role of the perfect husband, you still would never have gotten what you wanted." Julian slowly raised his head. His bloodshot eyes were filled with confusion. He wiped his face with the back of his trembling hand, trying to process what I was saying. "What are you talking about?" he choked out. "The will said the money was mine." Elijah read it. $80 million in assets. It was mine. I looked over at Elijah Montgomery. The old lawyer simply closed his leather portfolio and nodded at me, giving me the silent permission to deliver the final lethal blow. $80 million is a massive valuation, Julian, I explained, pacing slowly around the heavy wooden table. It is a very impressive number on a spreadsheet. But you have never actually understood how corporate finance works. You spent your entire life swiping my mother's credit cards and assuming wealth was just an endless pile of cash sitting in a vault waiting for you to grab it. But Hayes Holdings is a highly structured commercial real estate corporation. That $80 million does not exist as liquid cash. It exists entirely as corporate equity. It is comprised of company shares. Julian pushed himself up off the floor, slumping into his heavy executive chair. "So what?" he muttered defensively. "Shares are money, equity is money. I can sell the shares, I can cash them out, I own the company." "That is exactly where you are completely wrong," I said, stopping directly in front of him. "You do not own the company, you own paper. When your mother restructured Hayes Holdings last year, she intentionally split the corporate equity into two very distinct categories. She created Class A voting shares and Class B non-voting shares." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the polished wood. "The $80 million that was placed into your irrevocable trust consists entirely and exclusively of Class B non-voting shares. Do you understand what that actually means, Julian? It means you were handed an incredibly expensive car, but you were absolutely forbidden from having the keys, the steering wheel, or the engine." The blood completely drained from Julian's face as the financial reality began to set in. Preston, who had been sitting frozen in his seat, suddenly let out a sharp gasp. As a failed mortgage broker, Preston understood exactly what non-voting shares meant. He knew the devastating trap Vivian had laid out. "Let me break it down for you so there is absolutely no confusion." I continued, my tone sharp and unforgiving. "Holding non-voting shares means you have zero executive power. You cannot sit on the board of directors. You cannot vote on company policy. You cannot authorize the sale of a single commercial property. And most importantly, you cannot sell your shares to an outside buyer without the direct explicit approval of the majority voting shareholder." Julian shook his head violently, refusing to accept it. "No," he stammered. "No, I can leverage it. I can take the shares to a bank and use them as collateral for a massive loan. I can get cash that way. I laughed, a short, humorless sound that cut through the room. No legitimate bank in the country is going to accept minority non-voting shares in a privately held family corporation as collateral for a loan, Julian. They know you have no power to liquidate the asset if you default. Your shares are entirely useless to them. You cannot sell them. You cannot leverage them. You cannot trade them. Your $80 million is nothing but ink on a piece of paper. It is phantom wealth. You are entirely at the mercy of the executive board, I told him. The only way you would ever see a single dime of that money is if the board decides to issue a quarterly dividend, and they are under no legal obligation to do so. If the board decides the company needs to reinvest its profits into new developments, you get absolutely nothing. You would be sitting on an $80 million fortune while simultaneously being completely broke, unable to even pay your own electric bill. Vivian knew exactly who you were, Julian. She knew you were greedy, lazy, and incredibly reckless. She knew that if she handed you real liquid power, you would completely destroy the empire she spent 40 years building. You would sell off the historical properties to fund your luxury lifestyle and buy expensive gifts for girls like Amber. So she built a financial cage around you. She gave you the title of a millionaire just to stroke your massive ego, but she stripped you of every single ounce of actual power. She protected her life's work from her own son. Julian sat completely paralyzed in his chair. The crushing weight of his mother's ultimate rejection was far more painful than losing the money itself. Vivian had orchestrated his entire financial prison from her deathbed, ensuring he could never ruin her legacy. He had been completely outsmarted by a woman he thought he had successfully manipulated his entire life. But if I do not have the voting shares, Julian whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying new realization. If I do not have the power to control the company, who does? Who holds the Class A shares, Zuri? Who is actually running my mother's empire? He looked around the room frantically. He looked at Elijah, who simply stood in silence. He looked at Chloe, who was still staring blankly at her expensive handbag. And then he looked slowly back at me. The final horrific puzzle piece was finally starting to slide into place inside his arrogant mind. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. The realization was slowly suffocating him, but he still could not bring himself to fully admit it out loud. He looked back at Elijah, hoping the lawyer would offer him some kind of alternative explanation. He wanted Elijah to tell him that the board of directors was run by an old family friend or a neutral third party. But Elijah just stood there looking perfectly composed, letting the crushing silence do the work for him. I did not make him wait any longer. I reached back into my leather briefcase. I bypassed the divorce filing and the printed financial ledgers, pulling out a single crisp piece of heavy bonded paper. It was embossed with the official gold seal of Hayes Holdings. I held it up so the entire room could clearly see the thick black ink and Vivian's unmistakable signature at the bottom. When your mother restructured the company, she did not just split the shares to protect the assets from you, Julian. I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a verdict. She split them so she could quietly hand the actual power to someone who actually knew how to wield it. Someone who would not burn her life's work to the ground to impress a 23-year-old girl who chews gum at a will reading. I slowly walked around the edge of the mahogany table, moving closer to the head where Julian was still slumped in his chair. I placed the embossed document directly in front of him. This is an irrevocable proxy and transfer of executive authority, I stated firmly, tapping the paper with my index finger. Exactly 1 month ago, while you were busy sneaking Amber into luxury hotels downtown, your mother legally transferred 100% of the Class A voting shares directly into my name. She also named me the permanent chief executive officer of Hayes Holdings, effective immediately upon her death. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified gasp, pressing both hands over her mouth. Preston dragged his hands down his face, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. The phantom millions they had been planning to spend were now officially locked behind a door that I alone possessed the key to. Julian looked down at the document. He read his mother's signature. He read my name printed in bold letters right next to the title of CEO. His entire body began to tremble. It was not just fear or anger anymore. It was the complete physical collapse of his entire identity. He had spent his entire life believing he was superior simply because of his last name. He thought he was untouchable. And now the woman he had treated like a disposable servant, the woman he had violently thrown out of his house just a week ago, was suddenly holding the absolute power of life and death over his entire world. I own the company. Julian whispered, his voice completely hollow. You own paper, Julian. I corrected him sharply. I own the power. I control the board. I authorize the dividends. I decide if any of those commercial properties are ever sold. I control the payroll. I control. And as of this morning, I have officially frozen every single liquid asset account attached to the primary estate. You cannot withdraw a single dollar without my direct biometric authorization. I leaned down slightly so I was eye level with him. My voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper meant entirely for him. You thought you were erasing me from your history, Julian. But your mother made sure I am the only history you have left. You are completely and utterly at my mercy. And considering you just handed me a divorce petition and threw me out onto the street, I think you know exactly how much mercy I plan on showing you. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, tears of absolute defeat leaking down his cheeks. The arrogant, cruel king of the Hayes Empire was completely dead. In his place was just a broken, middle-aged man who had finally been forced to face the catastrophic consequences of his own monumental stupidity. He had absolutely no leverage. He had no money. He had no power. He was completely trapped in a financial prison built by his own mother, and I was the one holding the only key. But my total victory over Julian was violently interrupted. A loud, sudden crash echoed from the side of the table. Preston had suddenly slammed both of his hands down onto the solid mahogany wood, with enough force to rattle the crystal glasses. He pushed his heavy leather chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. He stood up, his face flushed a deep, angry red. The veins in his neck were bulging, and his hands were curled into tight, aggressive fists. The smug, condescending gatekeeper was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He glared at me, his chest heaving with heavy, aggressive breaths. He was no longer trying to play the role of the sophisticated elite. He was ready to get physical. Preston took a heavy, aggressive step toward me. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. You are a damn liar, he shouted, his voice echoing violently in the large boardroom. That piece of paper is a complete fake. Vivian would never hand the keys to her entire empire over to a glorified calculator from the slums of Atlanta. You forged that document. You broke into her hospital room and you forced a dying woman to sign over the proxy. I will have you arrested for elder abuse and corporate fraud before you can even walk out of this building. I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch or reach for my phone to call security. I just stood there, looking at this incredibly mediocre man trying to use physical intimidation because his fragile ego had completely shattered. You are projecting, Preston, I said, my voice dangerously low and completely steady. I highly suggest you take a deep breath, pick up your chair and sit back down. Because if you take one more step toward me, I promise you will not be walking out of this building as a free man. Preston scoffed, letting out a harsh, erratic laugh. You think you intimidate me? He sneered, closing the distance until he was standing just a few feet away from me. You think wearing a nice suit and holding a piece of paper makes you my equal? You are nothing but a lying gold digger trying to steal my wife's inheritance. I know exactly how to handle people like you. I am going to call the police right now and have you thrown in a holding cell. He actually reached into his pocket to pull out his phone. I did not try to stop him. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase one final time. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of printed audit statements bound tightly with a black metal clip. I slammed the heavy stack of papers down onto the polished mahogany table with a loud crack that made Preston jump. You want to talk about forgeries? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Let us talk about forgeries, Preston. Let us talk about what you were doing 2 weeks ago while your mother-in-law was lying in a hospital bed on a ventilator fighting for her last breath. Preston froze. His hand stopped halfway into his pocket. His aggressive posture instantly collapsed, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. I looked over at Chloe, who was still staring at me in total shock. Chloe. I said, my voice clear and projecting across the room. Did you know that your beautiful historic mansion, the one you live in rent-free, was fully paid off 30 years ago? Chloe nodded slowly, completely confused by the sudden change in topic. Yes, she whispered. Mom gave it to us free and clear when we got married. Well, I continued tapping the thick stack of audit papers. It is not paid off anymore. Exactly 14 days ago, a massive $5 million commercial mortgage was quietly taken out against the pure equity of your home. Chloe gasped, shaking her head violently. No, she stammered. No, that is impossible. Mom would never take a loan out on my house. She hated debt. I looked back at Preston, watching the sweat begin to bead on his forehead. You are absolutely right, Chloe, I said, never breaking eye contact with Preston. Vivian would never do that, especially not while she was in a medically induced coma. But the bank approved the loan anyway, because the authorization paperwork contained Vivian's exact signature. A signature that was flawlessly forged by the man standing right in front of me. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. He was completely suffocating in his own guilt. I am a senior corporate tax auditor, Preston, I said, breaking down his crime with brutal precision. Did you honestly believe you could hide a $5 million ghost loan from me? You used your high-level access to the family accounts to bypass the standard security protocols. You routed that $5 million directly into a dummy corporation you set up called Sterling Future Ventures. You stole $5 million from a dying woman and secretly mortgaged your own wife's house to do it. Julian, who was still slumped in his chair, looked up in absolute shock. $5 million? Julian whispered, staring at his brother-in-law. Where is the money, Preston? What did you do with my mother's money? I turned my attention back to Preston, watching him completely unravel. Yes, Preston, I mocked him gently. Tell the family where the $5 million went. Tell them about the unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. Tell them how you thought you were a financial genius and dumped the entire stolen fortune into highly leveraged volatile altcoins. Preston took a stumbling step backward, shaking his head violently. I can get it back, he whispered, his voice cracking. It was just a temporary dip in the market. I just need more time to let the investments recover. I laughed, a sharp, cold sound. You cannot get it back, Preston. I pulled the digital transaction receipts last night. You were margin called 3 days ago. Your positions were entirely liquidated by the exchange. The market crashed and it took every single stolen penny with it. You did not just hide the money, you completely incinerated it. You burned $5 million of your wife's inheritance to feed your own massive, pathetic ego. The boardroom descended into absolute stunned silence. The platinum Rolex on Preston's wrist suddenly looked like the cheapest piece of garbage in the world. He had walked into this room acting like the ultimate gatekeeper of the black elite, condescending to me about my working-class roots. He had mocked my neighborhood and told me I would never belong. Now he was fully exposed as a common, desperate thief who had robbed his own family blind. He was not a sophisticated investor. He was a degenerate gambler who had just lost absolutely everything. Preston stood completely frozen, staring at the heavy stack of audit papers resting on the mahogany table. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to salvage whatever tiny scrap of authority he thought he still possessed in this room. You cannot prove any of this, he stammered, his voice lacking all of its previous arrogant conviction. It is an internal family matter. We will handle it internally without outside interference. You are just trying to cause a scene because you are bitter about the divorce. I looked at him with an expression of absolute pity. An internal family matter? I repeated slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of his statement hang in the air. Preston, you forged the signature of a dying woman on official bank documents. You secretly mortgaged a historical property. You routed $5 million through fraudulent shell companies and wired it across international lines to unregulated offshore crypto exchanges. That is not a simple family disagreement over the dinner table. That is severe federal wire fraud. It is felony identity theft. It is grand larceny on a massive scale. Preston took a shaky step backward, vigorously shaking his head. The bank will not care as long as I make the monthly payments, he argued desperately. I can find the money. I just need a temporary bridge loan to cover the margins. I will pay it all back before anyone even notices it is missing. You cannot even afford to pay the valet parking fee downstairs, I said sharply, my voice cutting through his pathetic delusions. And you are not going to have the chance to find a bridge loan. I did not bring these audit files here today just to humiliate you in front of your wife. I brought them here as a courtesy to explain exactly why your freedom is officially over. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of confirmation paper. At exactly 6 o'clock this morning, I securely transmitted the entire encrypted hard drive directly to the White Collar Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I included the forged mortgage documents, the hospital medical records proving Vivian was comatose, and the exact IP addresses you used to execute the offshore wire transfers. The color completely drained from Preston's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He looked as though the floor had just dropped out from underneath him. "You called the FBI?" he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer unadulterated terror. "You turned me into the feds. I am a corporate tax auditor," I replied, my tone completely even. When I uncover massive federal fraud during a corporate review, I am legally obligated by my professional license to report it. But honestly, Preston, I would have reported you anyway, just for the absolute pleasure of watching you fall from your imaginary pedestal. A sudden sharp gasp drew my attention to the side of the table. Chloe had finally processed the entire conversation. The dense financial jargon had finally translated into a terrifying concrete reality in her mind. She slowly stood up from her chair, her eyes wide and rapidly filling with tears. She looked at the $200,000 Himalayan Birkin bag resting on the table, and then looked directly at her husband. "You mortgaged my house," Chloe said, her voice shaking violently. "My mother gave me that house free and clear. It was in my family for generations. And you secretly put a $5 million debt on it without telling me." Preston raised his hands defensively, taking a cautious step toward her. "Chloe, baby, please just listen to me," he pleaded, his voice frantic and completely stripped of its usual condescension. "I was trying to multiply our wealth. I wanted to surprise you. The market was supposed to go up. It was a sure thing. I was doing it for us to secure our future." "For us?" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing violently off the glass walls of the boardroom. "You lost $5 million on fake digital coins. You stole from my dying mother while she was on a ventilator. You are going to go to federal prison, and the bank is going to take my home. I am going to be completely homeless because of you." Preston reached out, trying to grab her arms. "I can fix it, Chloe. Just calm down and let me think." Chloe did not calm down. She pulled her arm back and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across Preston's face. The sharp, violent crack of her hand hitting his cheek echoed loudly through the entire room. Preston stumbled backward, clutching his face, his perfectly styled hair now completely disheveled. Chloe was shaking with absolute rage, crying uncontrollably as the illusion of her perfect, wealthy marriage completely shattered into a million pieces. While Chloe was screaming at her husband, a sudden frantic movement caught my eye. Amber, the 23-year-old mistress, had been standing quietly near the back wall, listening to the entire catastrophic meltdown. She was not a complicated girl. She had attached herself to Julian because he promised her a luxury penthouse, endless shopping sprees, and a life of total financial security. But in the span of 30 minutes, she had watched her golden ticket completely evaporate into thin air. Amber looked at Julian sobbing on the floor in a wrinkled suit. She looked at Preston clutching his slapped face, realizing the FBI was actively hunting him. She looked at me standing confidently at the head of the table, holding the actual keys to the $80 million empire. She did the math incredibly fast. Amber reached down and aggressively grabbed her bright orange designer handbag. It was a very obvious fake Hermes Birkin with cheap stitching that I had noticed the second she walked into the room. She did not say goodbye to Julian. She did not offer a single word of comfort to the man who was supposedly the great love of her life. She just clutched her fake bag, spun on the heel of her cheap shoes, and practically sprinted toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. Julian looked up just in time to see her running away. Amber. He called out, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic desperation. Amber, wait. Do not leave me here. We can figure this out together. I still have connections. Amber did not even turn around. She pushed through the heavy doors and disappeared down the hallway, running toward the elevator bank as fast as her legs could carry her. She was completely abandoning the sinking ship, leaving Julian totally alone in the wreckage of his own arrogant making. Julian slumped back against the thick wooden leg of the mahogany table, burying his face in his hands. His wife had completely outsmarted him. His mistress had abandoned him. His sister was screaming at her criminal husband. His mother had permanently locked him out of his own inheritance. He had absolutely nothing left in the world. And then, right on cue, a faint sound began to drift up through the thick glass windows of the boardroom. It started as a distant wail echoing through the busy downtown streets of Atlanta. The sound grew steadily louder and more urgent, piercing through the heavy, suffocating tension inside the room. Preston froze, dropping his hands from his bright red, stinging face. He turned slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, his eyes wide with absolute horror. The unmistakable sound of police sirens was echoing directly below us. Several heavy federal vehicles were pulling up to the front entrance of the Montgomery and Associates skyscraper. The flashing red and blue lights reflected faintly against the glass of the surrounding office buildings. "They are here," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the loud wail of the approaching sirens. "I highly suggest you straighten your tie, Preston. Federal agents do not like to be kept waiting." The flashing red and blue lights from the street below painted the ceiling of the boardroom in chaotic, frantic strokes. The wail of the sirens grew deafeningly loud, finally stopping right outside the building lobby. Preston stood completely frozen, his hands shaking violently at his sides as he waited for the inevitable sound of the heavy elevator doors opening to take him away in handcuffs. But while Preston was facing his literal imprisonment, Julian was facing a completely different kind of death. He was entirely stripped of his pride, his money, and his illusions. The man who had entered this room acting like a king was now nothing but a hollow, desperate shell. Julian slowly slid out of his heavy leather executive chair. His knees hit the thick carpet with a dull thud. He did not stand up. Instead, he actually began to crawl. He dragged himself across the floor, moving past the discarded divorce papers and the heavy mahogany table until he reached my feet. He threw his arms forward and wrapped his hands tightly around my ankles. He buried his tear-stained face against my shoes, sobbing with loud, ugly, heaving gasps. "Zuri, please," he begged, his voice completely breaking. "Please, you have to stop this. You have the power now. You can stop the board. You can fix the trust. We can go back home. I love you, Zuri. I have always loved you. I was just blinded by grief. The money made me crazy, but I never stopped loving you. You are my wife. We took vows before God. You cannot just leave me with nothing." He squeezed my ankles tighter, looking up at me with a pathetic, desperate expression. He was actively weaponizing the very concept of love, trying to invoke the sacred vows he had spit on just a few days prior. He honestly believed that the word love was a magic spell that could instantly erase the fact that he had evicted me, humiliated me, and tried to replace me with a 23-year-old girl. I looked down at the top of his head. I felt absolutely nothing. The love I once had for this man had been entirely extinguished. I slowly pulled my right foot back and delivered a sharp, cold kick, breaking his desperate grip on my ankles. I stepped back, out of his reach, looking down at him with absolute disgust. I am the head of the Hayes Empire now, Julian, I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of emotion. I do not need a nagging, arrogant man telling me how to live my life. The charity act is officially over. The only reason your mother kept you around was out of biological obligation, but she is gone now. You have completely outlived your usefulness, Julian. So take your cheap suits and get out of my building. Hearing his own cruel words fired right back at him acted like a physical blow to his chest. Julian collapsed entirely onto the carpet, curling into a tight, pathetic ball. He wept openly, mourning the arrogant king he thought he was going to be. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom suddenly swung wide open. 4 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers stepped into the room. Their eyes immediately locked onto Preston, who raised his trembling hands in surrender without saying a single word. I simply adjusted the lapels of my emerald green suit, picked up my leather briefcase, and walked right past my sobbing husband. I did not look back a single time. I step out onto the expansive glass balcony of my penthouse apartment. The warm evening breeze sweeps across the Atlanta skyline, bringing with it the distant hum of the city below. I look down at the glittering lights stretching out for miles in every direction. It is a magnificent view, and it belongs entirely to me. I did not secure this life through a lucky marriage or an unearned inheritance. I secured it through absolute precision, patience, and control. It has been exactly 6 months since I walked out of that mahogany boardroom and left my former family sitting in the ashes of their own greed. The Hayes Empire is currently stronger and more profitable than it has ever been, but the people who thought they owned it are living completely different lives today. Preston did not even make it to a criminal trial. The encrypted financial evidence I handed over to the FBI was so incredibly overwhelming that his own public defender advised him to take a plea deal immediately. The man who once stood in my foyer sipping expensive wine and delivering racist microaggressions is currently wearing a stiff orange jumpsuit in a federal correctional facility. He is serving a mandatory 7-year sentence for wire fraud and identity theft. The bank officially foreclosed on the historical family mansion just 2 months after his arrest. Without her mother's endless bank accounts or her husband's stolen millions, Chloe was completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. She tried to auction off her collection of designer handbags, but the vast majority of them were legally seized during the bankruptcy proceedings to pay off Preston's massive debts. Today, the woman who once scoffed at my working-class roots and paraded a $200,000 Birkin bag around a legal office is currently scrubbing feet at a discount nail salon in a strip mall just outside the city limits. She works double shifts just to keep the collection agencies from calling her burner phone. And then there is Julian, the former king of the Hayes Empire. The man who tossed a fake cubic zirconia ring at my feet and proudly told me I was nothing but the hired help. When the reality of his massive credit card debts and empty bank accounts finally crashed down on him, he was forced to file for total personal bankruptcy. In a desperate final attempt to survive, he formally petitioned the Hayes Holdings Board of Directors for a job. Any job, just to keep himself off the streets. As the chief executive officer, I personally reviewed and approved his employment application. Julian now works the late-night shift as a low-level janitorial contractor. He spends his evenings emptying trash cans, mopping floors, and scrubbing toilets in the exact same commercial high-rise he used to brag to his mistresses about owning. I raise my crystal glass, letting the aged amber bourbon catch the warm glow of the city lights. I take one final slow sip of my drink, enjoying the smooth, quiet taste of absolute victory. I look directly into the camera, letting a razor-sharp smile spread across my face. Revenge is not about screaming. It is not about throwing tantrums or crying on the floor. Revenge is a corporate tax audit calculated perfectly down to the last decimal.